So tonight we have Gabe Hickman with us. I kind of know the guy a little bit. And he's going to share with us what's going on in his life. And I'll let him tell you about the fellowship that he has. So, Gabe, the floor is yours. Have at it, son.
Well, thank you. Although, Dad, you said that you might know me a little bit, I'm sure that you wish you didn't sometimes. So, first of all, thank you for the nice introduction. Unfortunately, I don't know all of you, and I really wish I did. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here this evening, get to share the word with you. What Dad asked me to do was start off by just talking a little bit about my faith journey and to talk specifically about the fellowship that I've been coordinating for the last couple of years. So I guess we'll start all the way at the beginning. I believe that I became a Christian and that I was baptized in Christ when I was 10 or 11 years old. And after that, it wasn't a whole lot of doing anything except listening to Dad talk, which I don't say that begrudgingly. Those are some of the best memories of my whole life. But I didn't really do anything with the things that I learned, or I didn't even advance my knowledge in God on my own in reading until I turned 21. I started running a fellowship in the house that I lived in college with my roommates and with some of our friends. And that lasted for about 6 months. And it flourished while I had my focus on that. Things started to, like some of the friends started to move away, some of them graduated, some of us split apart, and eventually I found a role in leading a Sunday 9 Eastern, or what is it, 11 Eastern? Yeah, Sunday 11 noon Eastern. Sunday noon Eastern fellowship, and I've been doing that for about 1.5 years now. A couple of the people that are here, Michelle, Doug and Sandy Campbell, Rob Woods, you've popped in a few times. Just some of the people who regularly attend my Sunday early afternoon fellowship. But there's quite a few people there that have never been to this and don't know many of you. So with STF trying to grow the community through these virtual fellowships, I'm hoping that in the future we can find a way to overlay these groups of people a little bit so that we can get more involved. For example, James and Ellen, you guys are from Washington. We have a friend of ours that comes to my fellowship whose name's Donna Weedman, and she has a friend named Jewel that lives in Washington as well. So there's people that are potentially close to you that are also fellowshipping that you could connect with in real life. So I'm sure there's more instances of that, and I would hope that as we continue on going down this technological path, we can get more people to connect. For example, again, Michelle, there's quite a few people who attend the Sunday fellowship who live in Arizona. And it sounds like, is it this weekend you guys are getting together for a cookout and a party? Is that right? Or a pool party?
Pool party on Saturday. The
So,
head count is at least 14.
and that I just love that. Unfortunately, I can't be there. I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I really wish I could attend because if you haven't met some of these people in person that you meet on virtual fellowship, there is actually really nothing like it. I've met Mina in person, and that was just an absolute joy. Meeting Michelle in person was awesome. We went out and witnessed together. It was the first time I ever just went out witnessing for fun. It was when Michelle came to visit me. So getting to meet people that you meet on virtual fellowship, getting to meet them in person is just more of a blessing than you can ever imagine if you haven't experienced that. So I would encourage you to seek that out in your life because it's just wonderful. A little bit more about me personally. Like I said, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I have a wonderful wife. Her name's Emily. She just got done cooking dinner, and she's in the other room relaxing with our cat that we just adopted against my will. But it turns out I love this cat. I'm an engineer for Timty Trailers. So we make the big grain trailers that carry half of the United States grain. So if you've eaten food, there's a 50% chance that that food has either been carried in or fed by other food that was carried in our trailer. So I feel very blessed in the fact that I get to help feed the country. So that's a little bit about me. Does anybody have any questions before I get started with sharing the word with you all about the other fellowships or mine specifically that I can answer?
Yes, I would like a verification on what time it starts.
Noon Eastern.
Noon Eastern, okay.
Sunday mornings or afternoons.
Hey, Gabe, maybe I will put Gabe's Zoom code in the chat, and then maybe Gabe, you can throw your email in there if anybody wants to contact you.
I can do that right now.
All right.
Thanks, Dennis. I was just going to ask for that. Thanks.
Yeah. No, you guys, I mean, you're welcome to attend his fellowship too.
New York is Eastern time, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yep. So it would be 12 p.m. noon for you.
Okay.
Well, I guess I won't withhold the word from you guys any longer. So tonight, again, I'm very blessed with the opportunity and the honor to get to share the word with you all. It's very weird for me. I'll share this experience first off before I even get started. It's very weird for me to teach the Bible to you guys because the group that attends my fellowship is all similar. A lot of them have a way international background. It is very, it's an interesting experience. I don't always feel like I'm the right person to teach you. So bear with me if you already know what I'm sharing with you. Hopefully that you will hear something new. But if not, I hope that this teaching about the book of Job is really a blessing to you. So like I said, we're going to spend a good chunk of our time in the book of Job. We're not going to read a lot of the narrative, and I'm going to summarize most of the narrative, and then we're going to talk about that related to suffering. For those of you who attend my fellowship regularly, you guys know that Andy Trimble just finished a 3-part series on suffering. And he did not once touch the book of Job. And his teaching series opened up the concept of suffering to me so much that when I went back and I read the book of Job again, it lit up for me and exploded. And I found that what I thought that book meant was actually the exact opposite of what it means. So I'm excited to get to share my discoveries and share my learnings with you this evening. So why don't we go ahead and get started. The genesis for my dive into Christianity was the idea that the devil was in control of the world. And I found that to be a very helpful verse that in what I actually can't bring it to the front of my mind in 1 John, where it says that the whole world lies in control of the wicked one. Is that right? That verse became the evangelism tool of my generation that I stood on, because there's so many people who claim and cry out why bad things happen to good people. And what I did was I put that on as armor, and I said that this is the answer to why things happen in our world. And I felt very confident in that. Until I read the book of Job recently, and now I feel a whole lot less confident that I really understand why things happen in our world. And I'll get into that more as I continue. So the first verse I want to bring to the forefront of our minds relates to wisdom. We all know how important wisdom is. John Shainite does such a good job teaching us the importance of wisdom and how to get it. So Ecclesiastes 12:13 says, "This is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." So it would be very wise to fulfill our duty. It would be very wise to fear God. It is definitely our purpose and our job. But to fear God and keep his commandments, we have to know him. We have to pursue him. We have to search for him. Like it says in Isaiah 55, we need to seek Yahweh while he may be found. So we need to seek him, and with the intent of gaining wisdom. We need to make his ways our ways. We need to make his thoughts our thoughts. And all of us here, we're very aware that the way that we do that is mainly through his written word. And that's at the center of living a godly life and fearing him and keeping his commandments is being entrenched in his word. These are all very wise things to do, is going after God. It says in Proverbs chapter 9, starting in verse 10, that the fear of Yahweh is the starting point of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is the starting point of understanding. For by wisdom your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added to you. And it's a beautiful promise. There's plenty other promises in Psalms and Proverbs. Some more that came to mind for me is that whatever we do will prosper. It says this in Psalm chapter 1, that we will be surrounded with God's shield in Psalm 5, that we will have wealth and honor in this life in Proverbs 22, and also in Proverbs 22, that our children won't turn away from the things that we teach them. And these are some excellent and wonderful promises that are associated with gaining wisdom. I'm sure you've all heard these promises and are very aware of them. They sound great. It sounds like a foolproof method. If we gain wisdom and we walk in righteousness, these things will happen, until they don't. And then things start to get very confusing and very difficult to understand. And we see this in our world, right? Countless Christians have had their lives upended by natural disasters. Christians live in poverty. They get disease. They get sick. They get cancer. They're persecuted for the Lord, right? And right now we're seeing a rate of Christian missionaries in other countries. We're seeing them get killed at a rate greater than ever before in our lifetime, and just for being a Christian and standing for Christ. Jesus Christ was the greatest example that we have of fearing Yahweh and keeping his commandments, but he was executed. You know, when Jesus prayed for the cup to be taken away from him, it wasn't. When Paul prayed for the thorn in his side to be taken away, the thorn in his flesh, it wasn't. And he got a very peculiar answer from Jesus that we read in 2 Corinthians, that Jesus said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power reaches its fulfillment in weakness," or in suffering. So the main point from my introduction is that the righteous are not invariably spared from suffering. In fact, they sometimes suffer in agonizing and inexplicable ways. So why? Job asks the question, why? The book of Job leaves us with the question of why. It's the purpose for the book of Job. I'm sure you're all very aware of the narrative. Many Christians, although, are not familiar with the narrative. But the phrases, the sufferings of Job, the patience of Job, the wisdom of Job are very common in modern Christianity. I have a friend of mine who's never even read the book, and he can at least tell me something about it. The fact that Leviathan and Behemoth are mentioned there. But although these things are true, I don't think the understanding of the book of Job is very well developed in the modern Christian church. In fact, I would say that the most basic understanding that people have of the book of Job is that he suffered greatly and he lost all of his things, but because he was patient and faithful to God, God gave them all back to him. And oddly enough, I think that this is a very poor representation of the narrative. In fact, it leads you to believe the opposite of my thesis, the opposite of what I have come to find, is that at the end of the day, and I'll start with this thesis, we do not know why people suffer. We do not know why we suffer, and life is really just unfair. This life is unfair. So let's dive into the narrative of Job for a second. There's three main sections, and it's important that we look at the three sections kind of distinctly. The first, it's very simple. A prologue, then a series of dialogues, and then an epilogue. Very importantly, we have to understand the epilogue and we have to understand the dialogues based on what we learn in the prologue. So chapters 1 and 2 are the prologue of Job. We learn very importantly that Job is blameless and upright. He's one who feared God and turned away from evil. Obviously, he's not sinless, but we think of the Messiah when we hear these words. So he had very good righteous qualities. Sure, he had shortcomings just like the rest of us, but overall, he was blameless and upright. Also in the prologue, and this is probably the most important part for our understanding of the book, there's a conversation that takes place in the divine council where Satan suggests that the only reason that Job praises Yahweh is because of the blessings that Yahweh has given him. Very importantly, this conversation is hidden from Job. It's hidden from Job. And we as the reader, we really need to remember that this conversation is hidden from Job. It's easy to forget that, and we cannot. Also in the prologue, we see the most prominent instance of the idiom of permission I think that we can see in the Bible, where Yahweh grants Satan's request to take away Job's possessions and cause him bodily harm. Because of this, and because of the ancient Near East understanding, we see Job attribute his sufferings to Yahweh because of the fact that he literally grants permission. This is the idiom of permission. We know then that Job suffers great loss, just as Satan desired to. If we jump forward to the epilogue, we see a complete reversal of how the story starts, where Yahweh restores Job. So there obviously must be a lot that happens in the dialogues. So why don't we go ahead and get into that? So the first thing that happens really in the dialogues, or the most important part of the book of Job, revolves around these dialogues with Job's friends. So what happens is that Job's friends, they come to minister to him. They try to help him out of the trouble that he's in by giving him counsel. And what they end up doing, they share a theological perspective that I think is very relatable to the prosperity gospel, or believing. The idea of the doctrine of believing. They share that with Job. Very simply, that you can sum it up with, if you're righteous and you believe, God will fix your sorrow. If you sin and are unrighteous, you will suffer. For example, in chapter 8, Bildad, starting in verse 20, he says, "Behold, God will not cast away a blameless man, neither will he uphold the evildoers. He will still fill your mouth with laughter, your lips with shouting. Those who hate you will be clothed with shame. The tent of the wicked will be no more." And I found myself, as I was reading through Job, I'm sitting there and I'm reading it and I'm going, I agree with that, right? That sounds really good. What's wrong with that? And we find out later on, obviously, that Yahweh doesn't agree with what Job's friend said. So even though what it sounds like he's saying is good, in this case, we find out it's not. So the friends attempt to help Job by providing him a very cut and dry answer right out of suffering. Be righteous, and your suffering will end. So we know that there's something much deeper going on here, because we saw into the divine counsel in the prologue. We know there's something a lot deeper here than just Job not doing the right thing. We also know that he's blameless. So it's not as simple as the friends think it is. Job's friends actually take on the nature of Satan by accusing him, right? That's what our adversary does. He's an accuser. His friends, in an attempt to counsel him, accused him of being a sinner and doing evil when he really did it. So we know that Job continues on for 24 chapters of arguing with his friends until he says, "No more. I'm not going to argue with you anymore. I want to talk directly to Yahweh." And that is what happens. But unfortunately, what we see is that Job actually applies the exact same theology of his friends when he talks to Yahweh. When he talks to God, Job actually believes the same thing that his friends said. In chapter 31, verse 2, Douglas, can you use your microphone? Thank you. In chapter 31, starting in verse 2, Job says, "For what is the portion from God above and the heritage from the Almighty on high? Is it not calamity to the unrighteous and disaster to the workers of iniquity?" Later on in the chapter, starting in verse 24, he says, "If I have made gold my hope, and have said to the fine gold that you are my confidence, if I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gotten much, if I have seen the sun when it shined, or the moon moving in splendor, and my heart has been secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, this also would be an iniquity to be punished by the judges, for I should have denied the God who is above." And there's plenty of other statements that Job makes in his final appeal to Yahweh that follow the simple formula that these others do. It's very simple. What Job is saying is if he sinned, then suffering is what he should get. But he didn't sin, so suffering should have avoided him. And this is essentially the same thing that Job's friends did. It's bringing God's just nature and his just rule and the way that he sits sovereignly over the world into question. And God did not appreciate that whatsoever. Like I said before, the essence of what Job is appealing revolves around his main question of, why is this happening to me? And Yahweh responds immediately. So Job gets what he wants, although I don't think it was the response that he was hoping for. Excuse me. So in chapter 38, verses 1 and 2, it says that Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he asked, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Pretty harsh words. Well, God continues with the harsh words for over 70 rhetorical questions that attack Job's lack of wisdom. But he never answers the question, why Job? And I think that's a really big takeaway, is that he leaves that question unanswered. He asks Job a bunch of questions that eventually lead him to repentance and apologizing for questioning God's justness. But he never answers the question of why Job? So in the dialogues, like I've said, we see two improper theologies regarding prosperity. On one hand, we have Job's friends who claim that living righteously will avoid suffering. But on the other hand, we have Job who appeals that his upstanding nature should cause him to avoid suffering. Both of these, they really do sound logical, right? If we live righteously, we should get a righteous reward. If we live unrighteously, we should get an unrighteous reward. But in the record of Job, God refutes both of them. At the end, God he requires a sacrifice from Job's friends because of how they misrepresented him. And he obviously didn't like what Job was saying. He gave him a lot of very sharp rhetorical questions. So I'm sure that you're starting to see the wisdom that comes from this story. And what it really revolves around is the fact that God is just, right? God is just, and we don't always know what's going on in the heavenlies. Remember that Job did not know about the meeting in the divine council. So let's talk about some of the applicable things that we can take away from this in our practice as Christians. So one, if we look at Job's friends, there's often times where we really need to be aware of the amount of empathy that we are showing when we're counseling somebody. I know for a fact that there's been many times, because of my love of the idea that bad things happen because Satan is in control, because the wicked one is in control, where I have not shown a lot of empathy in my counseling because I thought that I knew why something was happening. I thought I knew. I thought I really understood what was going on in the heavenlies, which is also what Job thought. And when you think about that if you think that you know what's really going on in the heavenlies at all times, I think that's pretty naive. We've been around for a long time. We only get 80, 100 years on this earth with our two eyeballs in these physical bodies. So again, we need to act, or we don't know the cause of the source of someone's suffering. So we need to remember that when giving people counseling, and we need to show empathy. So again, Job's friends, they kind of used the opportunity. They used Job's suffering as an opportunity to have an academic debate. They used it as an opportunity to lay out this process of how you avoid suffering or why Job was suffering. So they definitely were not mourning with those who were mourning. So that's one of the points, right? Be aware of the empathy in counseling. We don't know why someone's suffering is happening, and we should mourn with them if we can. If they're mourning, we should mourn with them also. Point number 2, we need to be aware that the stuff we're dealing with in life could have absolutely nothing to do with our actions, with a lack of wisdom or sin. It might not. It also may. It's very frustrating when we are living a righteous lifestyle and things still aren't going right. So we need to remember that might not be the cause. We don't know it. Job didn't know what his cause was. Satan is an accuser. That is his role. That is one of his titles. It's possible that he is doing the exact same thing to Job with you, with us. And we can't blame God or question his justice. He is the most just. You know, we know that at the end of the record of Job, he gets all of his stuff back, and it's better. Now, like I said, a lot of Christians, they think that that's the message. That in this life, if you live righteously and you persevere through the suffering and you're patient and you're faithful, that you'll get your stuff back in this life. And that's not the message at all. The message is very much so an allusion to end times. It might not be in this life that we get our righteous reward for suffering. It might not be in this life where people get their unrighteous reward or punishment for their unrighteousness. In fact, we see that all the time, where the wicked prosper so much because they don't have somebody attacking him. So, again, we can't question God's justice. He knows what's going on. He's good at what he does. So point number 3, we don't know a lot about the spiritual dealings of the world. To say that we could take away to say that we could take away the idea that we understand how the divine counsel works just based on what we saw in chapters 1 and 2 of Job, again, I think that would be naive. There's all sorts of things that are happening that we don't understand. Think about Daniel chapter 10, where it took 3 weeks for the angel to get to Daniel because he got stopped by a demon. That's hard for us to wrap our head around. Why didn't you just run around him, right? Run away. So there's a lot going on that we can't wrap our head around. We don't know a lot about the spiritual dealings of the world, except that we are a part of it and that we have a role in it. The fact of the matter is, right, that we only see the world through our 2 eyes. The divine God, the angels, Satan, they see it on a very much so larger level. They see it in a fullness of everything that's happening on the heavens and the earth. So what's going on earth is much more complicated than if you act righteous, you'll prosper, and if you act unrighteous, you'll suffer. There's a lot more confusion. There's a lot more chaos that goes into it than that. Last part about that point. If God didn't tell Job why he suffered, he might not tell us either. Very simple. Point 4, there's a deeper spiritual meaning to suffering, or there's a different spiritual meaning to spiritual suffering than suffering in a physical way, like breaking a bone or losing a credit card or something like that. It is apparent that suffering without denouncing Yahweh brings glory to Yahweh. And I say that because if we stand righteously in a moment where we are accused by Satan and we prove him wrong, that brings Yahweh glory. There's a quote from a theology book that I've been reading lately that I want to read. It says that all humans live their lives before heavenly beings. They bring either praise to Yahweh or they vindicate Satan's claim that human beings love only themselves. So we have a choice to play in this spiritual realm. We can prove Yahweh right, or we can prove Satan right. And suffering is certainly a good time to do that, where we can really prove Yahweh right and bring him glory. We can bring a lot of good in spiritual warfare out of our suffering. The downside is that it's unlikely that we're going to know that we're going through spiritual suffering. Job didn't. So again, there's a deeper meaning, and I'm going to elaborate on that more in a moment. So I'm starting to wrap up. We know God works in all things for good, including suffering. And think about Christ, right? I'll elaborate on that more soon. Job suffered greatly, but through his suffering, he's a namesake of a book in the Bible that we all gain wisdom from. His record is a source of wisdom for every human being that has been able to read it. Job stood in the face of the accuser and proved him wrong. He brought so much glory to Yahweh, right? It's a story that almost all Christians know, right? And I alluded to this earlier, that in the short term, God did turn Job's suffering into the regaining of his prosperity. And that's going to happen for all of us too. You know, I haven't suffered that much in my life. Don't get me wrong. I've actually lived a very blessed and peaceful life. But I'm hoping that this wisdom that I've gained from reading this book and starting to understand it will protect me when I do come across some suffering. And for those of you who have suffered, you will get your righteous reward. And I can understand and I can empathize with you why it might feel like this life is not fair and it's not just, because it's not. But you will get your righteous reward. That's the promises. Yahweh is not going to fall short on his promises. Speaking of Jesus and how his suffering brought glory to Yahweh, he suffered more greatly than any person. He was beaten more than any person. And through that suffering came the salvation for all people. His power, Christ's power, was made perfect through his suffering. And I say that alluding back to the verse in 2 Corinthians where his power is made great in weakness, or is fulfilled in weakness. Think about this, that the actual promise to Abraham about Israel being a blessing to the entire world came through Christ's suffering. There's a lot of glory that came from Christ's suffering that came to God. So I want to read one more quote. It's a little bit of a longer one because, again, Job never gets his answer from Yahweh about why he endured suffering. And this author, his last name is Garrett. Unfortunately, I don't know his first name. He wrote a commentary on Job, and he answers for God. And this is his answer for God on why. That God's answer is this: I, Yahweh, am the one who can manage all the chaotic forces of life and who can bring about the ultimate triumph of righteousness. And I know what I am doing. If this has meant some suffering on your part, you must understand that this does not mean that I am unfair, or that you have the right to challenge my justice. I will do what must be done to defeat Satan and all the powers of chaos and evil. This may sometimes require suffering on the part of the righteous, but I will bring all good things to a just conclusion. Your role is simply to trust in my wisdom and trust in my goodness. And I have to say that only being in this understanding for admittedly a few days, there's some peace in not having to know why bad things happen. That's not my worry. That's not my concern. I don't need to have the answer to that question. All I need to do is I need to trust that God is just and that he's going to repay what needs repaid. So as I try to remember these things and I try to apply these key wisdom points in my life, I would encourage that you all do the same. Remember that this world is chaotic. There's a lot of stuff going on that we just don't know. There's no formula to avoid suffering, either our suffering or our friends, our families. There's not necessarily a way to know why suffering happens in our life or anyone else's. That our understanding of spiritual matters of this world is seen through a cloudy mirror. We need to learn to live in the comfort of just being a part of the spiritual battle, not that we have to understand it. And going back to the idea of prosperity, we know that living a life as a Christian doesn't always guarantee prosperity and comfort, although it doesn't promise suffering in this world, but it does guarantee prosperity and comfort and justice in the next life. We need to hold our hope. We need to hang our hat on that principle that justice is going to get paid out in the next life, and it will be served unabated. There's nobody going to stop that justice. So what we can do in this life is we can partake in the labors of Christ and Yahweh, and we can fight against Satan by remaining faithful, by refuting the accusations of the adversary, and we can persevere. The suffering that we experience in this life will count as a blessing in the future. So I know for myself, calling on God to put me through suffering is not what I'm doing. I kind of like being comfortable. But Jesus Christ in Hebrews 5, it says yet he, Jesus, learned obedience by the things that he suffered. So just like God works in all things for the good, let's find a way in our lives to work the sufferings that we have for the good. It's very easy to end a teaching like this with a statement like, let's be like Christ, and suggest that this is an easy thing to do. And I haven't tried it very much yet, but I can already say that it's very hard, but it's what we should be trying to do. Because we can bring glory to Yahweh through remaining faithful at all times, even when things aren't good. And that's exactly our purpose, to fear God, to keep his commandments, and to give him all the glory. So let's try to do that. Amen.